Want to welcome you to the Knoxville History Project. We've been doing these weekly Zooms at 6 o'clock since the middle of May. And I think I mentioned 2 weeks ago, it's already 2 weeks that we blew through over 1,000 people. So quite a few people have joined us weekly, but it's been great to reach a good number of people throughout the pandemic. And we're going to continue this series indefinitely, or at least until there's the demand maybe cuts off a little bit, so it's every week, but in the meantime, just plan on joining us every week. We are the Knoxville History Project, and we research and promote the history and culture of Knoxville. We do have some partners, and some of you may know Laura Still and Brent Minchy with Knoxville Walking Tours. Laura is on and Brent's every week, but I also want to put a plug in, especially because the weather's nice now, is if you've never done a walking tour of downtown, Laura is the lady to do it with. You can go to Knoxville Walking Tours. She does a tour with the early years of Knoxville, the gunslingers. She does them at Old Gray Cemetery, music history. Civil War is a popular tour that Laura does. She does have some kind of COVID-19 restrictions, and there's not tours on the calendar, but you can request days and tours, and she'll figure it out with a group. So we really encourage you to, if you've never done that, to learn more about downtown and some other places beyond downtown through Laura Still and Knoxville Walking Tours. I was talking to Sam Venable a few weeks ago. He did a tour, the women's suffrage tour with Laura, and just could not have more things to say about how well Laura does tours. And she's so knowledgeable, and she'll be back with us in 3 weeks tonight for a Haunted Knoxville Zoom. So look out for that. Also, something else that we do that you may not necessarily know we do is that we do historical research for clients, which could be you if you own a building or have a business, or there's a particular family history that you would like us to look at. We're looking at the Cal Johnson building. We work with conversion properties and the owners to do a research project to research and write actually a short booklet that helped with the pilot tax credit program with the city. And if you've not been down State Street recently, the building does not look like this. It's been restored and it's open for residents. Don't think there's a retail firm opened yet in the downstairs, but that's coming soon. But we've just finished a couple of historical building research projects for clients, and it really, it's not something we typically share with the public. However, in this case, we have. You can read the history of the Cal Johnson building on our website, and we may do that with other clients as well in the future. But if you're interested, reach out to me and Jack, and we'll be happy to talk to you about that. Also, like every week, I would encourage you to learn more about the history of Knoxville through our website. There's always tons of stories, and through our portal, you can access our driving tours. Jack and I are working on the South Knoxville driving tour, and hoping we'll have that in the next 2 or 3 weeks, so you can drive in lovely autumn weather. I encourage you to make a donation and support the work we do for you, the community. We've been very busy with book sales lately, so we appreciate if you've made a donation or bought a book recently. Next week, Jack is going to be talking about the origins of football, which is a little bit different this year, isn't it? So, that's next week coming up. And also want to put a plug for this book, The Mayors of Knoxville, which we did a year ago for the city of Knoxville. We don't sell it because it was a product we did that for them. But if you would like a copy, there's a couple of options. You can either, or 3 options really. You can go to Visit Knoxville, the downtown visitor center down on the corner of Gay and Summit, or you can order it through their website. It's $9.99, visitknoxville.com. Or you can check it out of the Knox County Library. I know definitely Lawson McGee Library has it, and maybe you can order it through some of the branches as well. So if you'd like to check out the book that informs this talk, that's how you can get hold of it. We just don't sell it ourselves. So we're looking at part 1, the 1800s, with Jack Neely, the Mayors of Knoxville. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Jack.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. It's an interesting subject, the mayors of Knoxville, and a lot of us can name the last 4 or 5 or 6, perhaps. But before that, we're kind of lost at sea. Even I was for many years about all of our mayors and what they did. There have been 69 of them so far. So it's it was as a result of kind of refurbishing the portrait gallery in the city, which looks better than it ever has been, that it ever has today, that they were looking around and realized that they didn't know who most of these people were or anything about them. So they enlisted us, the city did, a couple of years ago to look into the history of our mayors. And some of them, we have so much information, we could write books and books about them, but some others are very scant. They're kind of mysterious figures in history. And we'll be talking about a couple of both sorts tonight. We're talking mainly about the 19th century. I promised in some teasers we did that we would answer kind of a riddle. The last two mayors are Madeline Rohiro and India Kincannon, and they're very frequently mentioned as the first two female mayors of Knoxville. And of course they are, but they have something else in common too. And I kind of challenge people to wonder what that is, what makes them different from all mayors since before World War II. And it's another demographic category. They are both, neither one of them is from Tennessee originally. That's what makes them different. And the reason that's worth mentioning tonight is that in the 19th century, many mayors, in fact, I think about half of all the mayors in the 19th century were people who were not from Tennessee. In fact, many of them were from other countries altogether. We had 6 mayors who were born in other countries and had foreign accents, which is hard to picture today. But I think that's not a bad thing. They brought in new perspectives and new ways of looking at things and new ideals from many of which they'd brought here from their homes in Europe. But there's another kind of an interesting mystery about Knoxville that when you look at the founding date of the city, 1791, which you see on everything in Knoxville, and realize that the first mayor was in 1816. Well, why is that? Who was mayor in the 1790s? And the fact is that nobody is. Knoxville didn't have mayors in the 1790s because it was a capital city, and it existed only to be a capital city, and was more or less run by the governor and the legislature by way of a small commission of 3 guys who kind of ran the town. So we'll be talking about people beginning in 1816. We'll be talking about approximately 20 mayors in the 19th century, and I apologize if I don't mention your favorite 19th century Knoxville mayor, but I kind of picked out 20 people who were representative and especially interesting in one way or another. Sometimes for what they did, sometimes just for who they were. But anyway, it was. Knoxville didn't really form a modern city government. As I mentioned, it was run by the state legislature and a commission until about 1815. And what happened in 1815? The War of 1812 was over. People started looking around and began realizing that Knoxville existed to be a state capital originally, and it was about to lose that designation. The state capital, I think, very naturally, practically, was going to move to the middle part of the state, to Murfreesboro and eventually to Nashville. But Knoxville, which had been founded to be state capital, suddenly didn't have that purpose anymore. So people were looking around and saying, gosh, the legislature who used to run the commission doesn't care about us anymore, really. They're meeting soon going to be meeting somewhere else. But they looked around and noticed something else, and that was that in spite of the fact that many people thought Knoxville was going to be a temporary state capital place, there were some people with roots here. There were people who lived here. Over 1,000 people lived in Knoxville at that time. And I thought, this is enough to call it a town, and we think it's a permanent town. Let's start a city government. It's interesting that in 1816, the year that we first had a mayor of Knoxville, was the same year that we first had churches built in Knoxville. All these years, we think of this as a Bible belt, but Knoxville existed for 25 years without a church building. Nobody had even decided to invest in building a church in this city that might go this way or that. And many people were passing through just here for a few years and then gone somewhere else. But by 1816, it was starting to look like a permanent town, if not a major city. It was a permanent town with a mayor and churches, permanent things that kind of proved that it was a real place. But in those early days, there was very little for government to do. There was no such thing as a public school in the early 19th century in most of America. There were no public libraries. There was no public hospital, no public board of health. There was no police force, really. There were volunteers who would kind of keep watch at night and that sort of thing, but that was it. There was no fire department. The fire department was a volunteer squad. Volunteers would come out and form fire brigades when there's a fire, and a lot of places just burned down. These weren't pros doing this. But there wasn't even a city hall. There wasn't a place for the city council to meet, and actually wouldn't be for many years. But the big deal in those days was road improvement. The idea of having good streets in your town and was important, and was something that cost some money. So that was the preoccupation of the early mayors of Knoxville and the early councils. I always like to mention, when I mention these early days, when we first elected the first city council, the first board of aldermen in 1815, there were 7 guys, and 3 of them were Irish immigrants. We often think of the Scots-Irish, and we think of people settling here as people who are descended from immigrants. But these were actually immigrants, people, and they carried on city council meetings in Irish brogue in these early days. But their very first, the first mayors in those early days were chosen by city council from among their own body. They were kind of like the chairman of the board of aldermen, and they picked the first guy who carried the title of mayor of Knoxville was named Thomas Emmerson. It's Emmerson with 2 M's, not like Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emmerson was from Northern Virginia. He was from a kind of the planter class in Northern Virginia. Was an attorney. He came down here just first to practice law, but then was kind of brought into city government. Emmerson was a fairly interesting fellow. He, as mayor, he was interested in civic improvement from the date he was inaugurated in 1816, and they served very short terms in those days, as you notice. He was mayor for just about 2 years. His first job was to start a tax system, and he began a poll tax system, and that was. We think of poll taxes today as something that you paid in order to vote, but in the early days, poll taxes were just, if you lived in a town, you had to pay taxes for being here. You might have to pay $1 a year or whatever it was, but with your white or black, male or female, you had to pay $1 for the privilege of living in a place, and that $1 a year helped to pay for roads, basically, and that was what it was for. And the alderman decided how to use that money. Emmerson was the guy that began that tax system, and love him or hate him for that. That was important for an important step for a city administration to make. Interestingly, after he was mayor, and there are a few mayors like this in Knoxville history, people who didn't stay here after they were mayors, they moved on to somewhere else. At age 50, I don't know if it was a midlife crisis or what, but he just kind of gave up on the whole rat race of the big city of Knoxville to a slightly smaller city, and went to Jonesboro, a slightly smaller, slightly older city, and concentrated on journalism and agriculture. In fact, he did journalism about agriculture. He was fascinated with the latest technologies and chill plows and things like that, and would write stories about this. And interestingly, in Jonesboro, he met a much younger journalist named William G. Brownlow, who would later be a major figure in Knoxville and Tennessee history. That Parson Brownlow was a guy who was actually a young Methodist parson when Emmerson knew him, and he said, "Hey, you're a good writer. Why don't you try journalism?" And Brownlow got involved with journalism in Jonesboro and brought it with him when he came to Knoxville many years later. But anyway, that's a bit of a side note. But Jonesboro is better, as if you've ever been there, you can tell they're better at keeping their old houses than we are. We don't have a house where Emmerson lived, our first mayor. We don't even know where it would have been. And in fact, we don't have the house where Brownlow lived either, still standing. But Jonesboro still has houses where both Brownlow, as a very young man, And Emmerson, as an old man, lived at the same time in Jonesboro. Emmerson is buried in Jonesboro in very picturesque grave, this being consumed by a tree. But anyway, it was the discovery of his portrait, this portrait in particular, in 1934. Everybody had forgotten who he was. I think if you'd asked someone 100 years ago in Knoxville, if he'd gone to the library and asked the librarian who was the first mayor of Knoxville, it would have been a tough thing to figure out. People just didn't have that kind of memory to keep that sort of thing. But this portrait turned up in 1934, and suddenly there was a great deal of interest in Thomas Emmerson in particular, but other mayors of Knoxville as well. And there was kind of the seed, the beginning of this idea of putting together a portrait gallery, which I'm glad to say we have. We have a few mayors that don't have portraits, but most of the mayors since Emmerson have portraits hanging in the portrait gallery. But the next, the second mayor, who is also the fourth mayor, I mentioned the first Board of Aldermen had 3 Irish immigrants. We had our first immigrant mayor was our second mayor, and that was Mr. James Park. That's our picture of James Park from his era. He was an Irish immigrant, was from Northern Ireland, from County Donegal, but he came to the United States in 1796, probably as a refugee. This was a time when Protestants Presbyterians actually were leading a revolt against the crown in Northern Ireland. And this was an era when James Park and many other Irish people came to Knoxville and ended up here. Some of them had been revolutionaries who came here. I don't know for sure that he was, but things were tough in Ireland. So he came over here at that time and distinguished himself in many respects here in Knoxville. He married a woman from Delaware here, and they had a very, very prolific family. They had 12 children, almost all of whom survived to adulthood, and most of whom lived into very ripe old ages in their 80s and 90s, even without what we think of as modern medicine. But he was kind of an intellectual guy. He was all about road improvements and things like that. He was about building the city of Knoxville and making something more of it. But he worked hard at his job at that. But he also sometimes wrote reviews and essays for the newspaper. Was a reader. Was an interesting guy that I think a lot of us would have enjoyed getting to know. He lived a good long time. He was born in 1770, before the Revolutionary War, and lived into the 1850s, just before the Civil War, amazingly. But he lived long enough to be buried at Old Gray Cemetery, which was new at the time, and that's where you can find his grave today. But interesting guy. We just showed the house where he lived. That was a house that was begun by Governor John Sevier to be his governor's house in Knoxville, when Knoxville was the capital. But Sevier, this was an era when governors ran out of money, and that's what happened to poor John Sevier. Didn't have money to finish his house. But James Park, enterprising Irish immigrant, came along and finished the house and lived there for he and his family lived there a very, very long time. His son, who was also named James Park, was a Presbyterian minister, was born in this house and died in this house 90 years later. That was the Park House that whole time. It's been a few other things since then, but it's now the headquarters of the Gulf and Ohio Railroad. But Pete Clausen's concern. But interesting house. I'm lucky we saved it. The Whittle building, aka the federal courthouse, is built very closely around it, behind it. But interesting old house, one of the oldest houses in downtown Knoxville. But anyway, the next mayor we're going to be talking about is a guy whose house, I'm sorry to say, is not still standing. Joseph Churchill Strong. He was an interesting guy. I mentioned a lot of the mayors of Knoxville in the 19th century were not from Tennessee, and he's an example. He was from Connecticut, but he was the patriarch of the family that if you know of Russ Strong School in Jefferson County, or Sophronia Strong Hall, which has been mostly torn down on UT campus, or a Strong Stock Farm. These are all from the same guy who who moved here in Knoxville's very early days, and was much respected. He was a doctor, very respected doctor. It's surprising how many early mayors were physicians, but he was the first of those. He was known to be we didn't have a public hospital, but he had his house, which was in downtown Knoxville on State Street. Some people my age and older may remember the old Strong house that was down there between State and Gay Street. But that was a house that he called the Maison de Santé, which was the house of health. That was where he lived and where he took care of his patients. But this is his grave at First Presbyterian Churchyard downtown, and it's about all we have of him today. We don't have a good picture of him. But he was a very influential figure of his time, and Dr. and a mayor. All right, and here's a better look at that churchyard, which has a few of our earliest mayors. This churchyard dates back to the 1790s, by the way. The oldest grave that you could read is that of William Blount, who died in 1800. But we have descriptions of travelers who came through here in the 1790s, and they mentioned that there was a churchyard there. A lot of the graves are just so weathered that you can't read them anymore, and of course some of them are missing. But this has been a churchyard since the 1790s. But another person buried there is our next mayor, who was a guy named Donald McIntosh. He was our only Scottish-born mayor, and what's a more Scottish name than Donald McIntosh? But he was actually born at Inverness, in the famous kind of medieval castle city in Scotland, and was educated at the University of Edinburgh. We've hardly ever had a better educated mayor than Donald McIntosh, which is kind of sad because he didn't have a terribly good end. He was a well-educated, a much respected physician in his youth. But he was mayor for a rather short couple of years, but resigned in early 1834 over a funding issue having to do again with road improvements. It was all the whole city administration was entirely about road improvements in those days, and there's something about some dispute about the funding. And he and two aldermen quit over this issue and kind of put the city into a kind of a crisis. And he died a couple of years later at a very young age. He was only 40 years old, our youngest mayor to die in our history. But this is about all that remains of what we have of him. We don't have a picture of him either, just his little gravestone in the churchyard. But all right, the next one is a guy who's I threw in because he's kind of a mystery. He was an influential guy, both as a public and private citizen, Solomon Jacobs. And some people have wondered about his ethnic background. With a name like that today, you might assume that someone today named Solomon Jacobs might be Jewish, and he was dark complected, had dark hair, and was could have passed for Jewish, but he was. There are a lot of people named Jacobs in Tennessee, and Solomon was not as unusual a first name in those days as it is today. So we really don't know for sure. He was a member of a Presbyterian church, but we don't know exactly what his ethnic background is because we don't know where he even came from. He just kind of appears on the scene at some point. He's believed to have been born in 1795 and was much a builder of riverboats and railroads. Riverboats first and then railroads, when it was obvious that was going to be the destiny of Knoxville more than riverboats. It was the president of the big railroad convention of 1836. This was an enormous thing that met here in Knoxville when during this brief period when Knoxville was looking like it was going to be the hub of a giant railroad network across America, connecting Cincinnati to Charleston, and Knoxville was going to be right in the very center. It was going to be kind of like the Atlanta hub airport for like a railroad station for the whole inland part of the United States of America. There was a great deal of interest. Henry Clay was interested. A lot of national figures were interested in this thing. Daniel Calhoun from South Carolina. All these people were involved, or either at least had an agent at this big convention, of which Jaques was the president, right after his term as mayor. But anyway, he furthered Knoxville business in many ways. Really tried to build railroads here, and I think saw this big consortium of interest in railroads come apart. It just really within a few years, it was just a kind of a historical oddity, this idea that Knoxville was going to be a hub for this big railroad system. And in fact, people realized how hard it was going to be to get railroads through to Knoxville. There are so many mountains you had to blast through and bridges you had to cross to get railroads, and also so many dishonest and corrupt investors who got into it just to make some money and then got out. But Jacobs eventually gave up on railroads here, gave up on Knoxville altogether, and took a job in Washington, D.C. as assistant to the Postmaster General. And he moved to Washington in the around 1850 or so. And we don't know what happened to him at all. I've looked around some in online Washington sources and elsewhere. I'm sure there might be some librarian with resources in Washington who can help us on this, but he's one of our only two mayors that just vanished into thin air, more or less, after their term, and we really don't know when or if he died. But an interesting looking fellow, and an interesting, potentially a very dynamic fellow in his youth, and someone we should find out more about. And he's one of many reasons that history is never completely told. That we'll never tell the history of just of Knoxville mayors until we learn a lot more about Mr. Jacobs. But interesting guy. All right, the next one we're going to be talking about is a guy named Frederick Heiskell. I had an interesting experience about 2 years ago. I went to got to give a talk up in Hagerstown, Maryland, at the really cool art museum. If you ever get to go to Hagerstown, look at the old art museum right in the middle of town. But the name Heiskell it shows up over and over in Hagerstown. It was one of the early settlers of Hagerstown were named Heiskell. And as it turns out, Frederick Heiskell, the first person named Heiskell in Knoxville, was from Hagerstown, Maryland. But I gave my talk partly about all the people who were born in Hagerstown and came to Knoxville and came basically down what we know as I-81 down to East Tennessee. Hagerstown is kind of at the other end of I-81, but down through that long valley of across Virginia that goes through the Natural Bridge area and all that. But came from Hagerstown and came down here until they found a place they wanted to live, and that was Frederick Heiskell. He came down here and became involved first in publishing. He was really interested in publishing. Knoxville, when it had been a state capital, became a publishing center very naturally, because a state capital, what do? You make laws, and to promote the laws, to make the laws, to let all the lawyers and judges across the state from here to Memphis or Chickasaw Bluffs know what the laws are. You got to print the laws, and that was what they did here in Knoxville during the capital eras. And we had printing presses here, and they were always working, putting out these law books, and they were publishing treaties and newspapers with all the stories about the legislature and all these things. So there's a lot of printing going on, a lot of publishing going on. And even after we lose state capital status, there were still these printing presses. They're too big to move, so people kept them here. Frederick Heiskell acquired one of these printing presses and began printing a paper called the Knoxville Register, which lasted for about 50 years, one of the longest tenured newspapers of the 19th century. But he was a newspaper publisher, but he's also a book publisher, and he published some books, including the very first books ever published in or about the new Cherokee language, the language that Sequoyah had come up with using new characters to relate Cherokee words. And in fact, there was like a Cherokee spelling book that was published in Heiskell's press for the Cherokee Nation, basically, and for people who wanted to learn more about the Cherokee Nation, which was still at that time located in North Georgia. But Heiskell was an active guy in lots of ways. Was mayor rather briefly, I think, in 1835, and it was about this time that he was in middle age. He'd been living downtown, that he bought a house that had been owned by Charles McClung, an early surveyor. I think we can call him one of the founders of Knoxville, son-in-law of James White. But he bought McClung's house out in the 10 Mile Creek area in West Knox County, and what's now Peters Road, but it was the house that was called Statesview, and Frederick Heiskell moved in there, and he lived there longer than Charles McClung did. He lived there in the middle part of the 20th century. Heiskell is an interesting guy, kind of a tragic figure in some ways. If he had died in his 70s, we would think of him as a progressive figure, both in terms of government and race relations and things like that. He was so interested in the Indians. But he, and then it came to the Civil War. He was a Unionist during the Civil War, very strong Unionist, even though his sons, a couple of his sons were Confederates. So this was there were family issues within that house that's still standing there on Peters Road at Statesview. But after the war, though, like a lot of disconcerting a lot of Tennessee Unionists, people who were Unionists because they didn't want to split the nation up over slavery. They wanted to keep it together. They were Unionists. After the war, they got used to the idea that slaves would be freed. They became emancipationists. But having gotten to the point of being emancipationists, they were not for black suffrage. They were not in favor of the former slaves getting the vote. And that describes Frederick Heiskell. He was a Unionist, a very strong Unionist, but after the war was not crazy about this idea of black people having equal civil rights with white people. He was a very old man at this time. He was 80 years old. He ran for Congress as a conservative, lost very badly. And I think, like a lot of people I've noticed when they're I say notice in history, I mean to say, not in present day, but when people lose a race and lose it badly, they sometimes just leave town, just want to just start over, even at the age of 80. And that's what he did. Heiskell moved away, moved to Rogersville, not very far away, but he spent the last 16 years of his very long life in Rogersville. But an interesting guy, a cautionary tale in some ways, but a fascinating character. Began this Knoxville Register, and ironically, as he was a Unionist, the Knoxville Register was a Confederate paper during the Civil War. It was the last Confederate paper, and was shut down when the Union Army came into Knoxville in 1863. He had, years after, Heiskell had sold it to other people. But anyway, an interesting fellow, as many of these people are. All right, the next one we're talking about is W.B.A. Ramsey, back from the days when people had three names before their last name. William B.A. Ramsey, I don't remember what his second and third names were, but he had a couple of distinctions. I mentioned all of these mayors so far were people who were from somewhere else, and some of them from very far away, whether it was Hagerstown or County Donegal. William B.A. Ramsey was from Knox County, and he was the very first mayor who was from the immediate Knoxville area. He was a riverboatman in his youth. I should mention, by the way, he actually grew up in the Ramsey house that still stands, the wonderful stone house that still stands out in the Forks of the River area. But it's he was an adventurous guy as a young man, was a riverboatman, ran riverboats between here and Muscle Shoals. But he in 1838, there was a change in the city charter, partly as a result of state legislation, and we suddenly had the right and privilege to elect mayors by popular vote. They weren't just elected kind of as the chairman of the board of aldermen. and W.B.A. Ramsey was the first mayor to be elected by popular vote. He won by one single vote over James Park, who was running for an unprecedented third term as mayor. But anyway, he was mayor for that couple of years, and thought he was worth mentioning in this group. He later went on to Nashville, I believe, and had a role in state government, but lived a good long life, as did his brother, who was a well-known physician and historian, J.G.M. Ramsey. But all right, next we're talking about a guy that was actually mentioned on Antiques Roadshow a couple of years ago, and I'll tell you why. Samuel Bell, born in 1798, was from the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. He was, and he came down, it must have had a family issue or something, but he came down here with his younger half brother, whose name was George Washington Harris. George Washington Harris, you might know if you're a student of American literature, is one of the best known American humorists of the Civil War era. They both came down here to Knoxville together, but George Washington Harris came up with the character of Sut Lovingood, but at one time they worked together. Samuel Bell was a metalsmith and a jeweler. He had a jewelry and metalworking shop in downtown Knoxville, and he regarded his younger half brother, who was still a kid at the time, as kind of an apprentice. George would help Samuel Bell around the shop. Well, Samuel Bell became well known and respected in the city of Knoxville, but partly because he was becoming famous as a metal worker. I think he first got his fame when Sam Houston won the Battle of San Jacinto using silver spurs that had been made by Samuel Bell back in Tennessee in 1836. And this, I think, got him a certain amount of renown. And something else that happened in 1836 was a guy named Jim Bowie died at the Alamo. And Samuel Bell was creating a new kind of knife that Jim Bowie liked, called the Bowie knife. And this was something that became very, very popular. And Samuel Bell became famous as one of the greatest, the best manufacturers of Bowie knives. But this may have had something to do with the fact that after he was mayor of Knoxville and he was a fairly popular mayor in the 1840s, he moved as a fairly old man, moved to San Antonio, Texas, which is the site of the Alamo, and kind of became ground zero for Bowie knives. And anyway, but to this day, Samuel Bell Bowie knives are much prized by collectors. And I forgot, I think this Bowie knife that was on the Antiques Roadshow 4 or 5 years ago went for, was it $50,000? It was amazing, a lot of money. But they talked a little bit about Samuel Bell at the Antiques Roadshow that was in Texas that time, I believe. But another interesting fellow. You don't think of mayors of Knoxville as being makers of implements of defense or attack, whatever you choose to do with a Bowie knife. But anyway, an interesting fellow with a very interesting little brother who stayed here a bit longer than he did, but he also left Knoxville at the time of the Civil War as well. But all right, the next one we have Gideon Hazen, who's I mentioned him here because his even if we don't know his name, he was mayor just for 1 year, 1842. We know him for a couple of long streets in West Knoxville that would have different names if not for things that he did. Mayor in 1842, he by this time had already founded a paper mill in West Knoxville with his partner Marcus DeLafayette Bearden, the elder. We'll be talking about the younger in a little bit, but there are two Marcus DeLafayette Beardens, but Gideon Hazen made a partnership with them, and built a paper mill on Third Creek. I just noticed in the last few years, I'm not sure who did it, but someone put a sign up on kind of the eastern end of paper mill that shows exactly where the paper mill was. It was there for quite a long time. It was destroyed by a fire once and rebuilt. It was wiped out by a couple of floods and rebuilt. It was there a good long time, and the paper mill was actually still standing as a ruin up until the 1950s, I believe, when they built I-40, and it had been being used as a house in its later years, but was finally torn down. But Paper Mill Road, of course, is named for his paper mill. The other thing that we know is the name Middlebrook. Middlebrook Pike was named for his house, which was called Middlebrook, and which is still standing and is a private home that's occupied just off of Middlebrook Pike. Beautiful place if you ever get a chance to see it. It's a lovely house, lovely grounds to it. But this was Gideon Hazen's world out there, more or less. It was his son, Russ Strong Hazen, who was a member of married into the Mabry family, and that's why we have the Mabry Hazen house. His son lived at the Mabry Hazen house in later years, but it's about the only one in the history of the Mabry Hazen house that didn't get in some kind of trouble or scandal or something. But anyway, he's another guy, mayor just for 1 year, but someone we remember, whether we do or not, through the names of our more prominent streets. All right, Samuel Beckett Boyd was mayor in 1847 to 51. Not a terribly becoming picture of him. This is the only one that we have, but he was a guy that was fairly prominent in Knoxville. He married the great granddaughter of George Mason, one of the founding fathers of Virginia, and the name Mason kind of rings in the family after their marriage. But he was a very in the late 1840s, very early 1850s, was a very progressive, very decisive mayor in many respects. Was the guy that founded the first board of health. He worked on sidewalk improvement. He worked on where to put the railroad station. After all these years of getting a railroad here, we thought, where's it going to be? We're going to try to bring it all the way up to the top of the hill and near the courthouse, or we're going to put it in a more sensible place where they actually did finally put it. But we know where the southern station is today is there partly because Samuel Beckett Boyd and his committee decided that was the best place for it, to be on flat land below the city rather than all the way up on top of the city that would require trestles that would need be expensive and require a lot of servicing. But this was he was influential in a lot of these early respects when Knoxville was really becoming a city. They knew it was finally getting railroad transportation, which is one thing that had held it back, but things were starting to really roll to begin with in a big way. One of the things that changed Knoxville was the fact that in the 1840s, Knoxville built something that was rare anywhere in America, and that was a school for the deaf. We built the 8th school for the deaf in America, and this is a Civil War era picture of the School for the Deaf, which is a building you probably recognize. But this was Samuel Beckett Boyd, mayor, was supervised the construction of this state-run school. It was a big deal for Knoxville, maybe bigger than the university was, because the university was just really intended just for East Tennessee at the time. And this was a statewide school for the deaf. If you were deaf in Tennessee and wanted a good education and lived in Memphis, you would come all the way to Knoxville and move in, more or less. It was a residential school. And this was a very big deal and a major something Knoxville had to be proud of in a big way that happened. Really, this building was built during Boyd's administration, and you see the date on the front of it, 1848. But it was a big deal. But this is what it looks like today. This is the Lincoln Memorial University School of Law. This is the same building that Boyd and people that were working for him built back then. And it's been since then, interestingly, if he had been mayor a century later, he would have come to work here. This was from 1924 to 1978 or 9 was Knoxville City Hall. So this is where the mayor's office was, where the city council met. But in recent years, it's been Lincoln Memorial University's law school with a relatively new statue of Abraham Lincoln in the front of it. But a remnant, a rare remnant, I should say, from that era. I think there are only 5 buildings downtown that date before the Civil War, and this is one of them. Of course, it was a hospital during the Civil War for both the Confederate and the Union armies. But the next shot is the house where he lived, and that's it's kind of an interesting surprise that many years after a governor lived there, Samuel Beckett Boyd lived in this house, which was it wasn't the best house in Knoxville. It was a frame house, probably kind of run down already by that time, but I think he knew the history of it and just wanted to live there, and he and his family lived there for many years afterwards, and was quite a lot of other interesting people came out of this house, people who grew up there, including his son, who bears his wife's famous maiden name, John Mason Boyd, Dr. John Mason Boyd, whose name you probably recognize because it's on the well-known porte cochere on the courthouse lawn. Yeah, here it is. This was our beloved physician, Dr. John Mason Boyd. This was the son of the mayor, but had a much respected physician. Was involved. One of the things I want to write about soon is the first successful hysterectomy in allegedly in American history, and he was one of 3 doctors who attended to this in the 1850s. But that's just a little remnant of the Boyd name. By the way, Boyd was also an ancestor of Miss Eugenia Williams, whose house has been the object of such fascination on Lions View. She was kin to the Boyds, I think, on her mother's side. But all right, who we have next here? William G. Swan. He was from Alabama originally and was mayor in 1855, 1856. I keep saying these are interesting fellows. They're all interesting fellows, but his father had been killed in a gunfight down in Alabama. He was kind of a classic Southern character in some ways. He was a secessionist when the Civil War came along. Before the war, with Irish immigrant John Mitchell, former Irish revolutionary, he founded a paper called the Southern Citizen, which was a pro-secessionist, pro-slavery paper that was published here in Knoxville in the 1850s, but right after he was mayor. But interestingly, as mayor, though, he was fairly progressive in some ways, at least about city improvements. He was all about paving the first paved streets in Knoxville. We have William G. Swan to thank for pushing that forward. Gas lighting was something that he worked on to do when we have public gas lighting. We could walk around on Gay Street at night and not just be in pitch black dark. But he also proposed something that didn't actually get done. He proposed a canal between First and Second Creeks. This was at the time, notice his dates, 1855. He was the mayor that greeted the first railroad, the first trains to arrive in Knoxville in 1855. And I often say that Knoxville was really born at that time. Knoxville was born as an industrial city in 1855. But this was, he had this dream of putting in a canal between First and Second Creeks, and connecting First and Second Creeks alongside the railroad station, so that you could just unload from the railroad, and yeah, here's a picture of it. Unload from the railroad. If you can picture a canal going along the bottom of this hill under that bridge, that's what he dreamed of, to have something that you could offload from train cars and put onto boats and take down to the river, or vice versa. It's an interesting idea, and I'm not sure that it's impossible, but that never happened. But something else did happen, something that he partnered with Joseph Mabry. I'm sorry, Paul, let's go back to the previous picture. This is what North Knoxville looked like right after Swan's administration. William Swan and Joseph Mabry had this idea that once the railroad got through here, suddenly people would be interested in the north side of town, and they would be, this would be valuable property. But to be sure it was valuable, they wanted to, they bought all this property and decided to donate the middle part for a permanent city market. And you can see the city market right up here. Yeah, Paul's pointing out with the arrow right there. That was the very first market house. And if you can imagine, that is the center of Market Square today. There were only a few buildings right around it at that time. But within 10 years, they were right. All the property that they bought over there was very profitable, very popular. That they did they eventually, I think it took them longer than to happen than they wanted it to. And I'm not sure that William Swan, because the Civil War arrived afterwards, that he made a lot of money on this himself. But William Swan actually was, I say he was a secessionist. He ran for Confederate Congress and actually was a member of Confederate Congress, was sent to Richmond to represent this district in Congress. As we had another representative in U.S. Congress, Horace Maynard. It was an interesting, the one time that Knoxville had two congressmen representing the same city. But anyway, he went to Congress, was a much fiercer, Mabry had been a secessionist too, but he was a practical businessman. And by the end of the war, he was cooperating fully with the Union folks. But Swan was not quite the same sort of guy, and he was not sure that he would feel welcome, and even in the city that he had been mayor of after the war. So he moved to Memphis, which was a place where he had more political allies at least, and lived the rest of his rather short life in Memphis. He died in 1868. Anyway, he was a mayor in the mid 1850s. There was a period of instability, and in the late 1850s, and it had a lot to do with financing, arguments about how to pay for things, but I can't help but think that basic political instability having to do with the war on the verge, that nobody really knew what was going to be going on in Knoxville just around the corner in the late 1850s, that we had a period when we had about 8 mayors in about 2 years. It was just one mayor after another would be mayor for 5 months perhaps, and then resign, and someone else would take over as interim. They would resign, just have enough of it. And there are a lot of these mayors, and we tried to treat them all equally, and we tried to look up information about each one of them. There are 2 or 3 that were really stumped us, that we know very, very little about. And if you see the book and know something about these folks, let us know. But they were, it was kind of a revolving door of mayors for a while, until a new mayor came in, a guy who actually had been mayor before the war, was a guy named James. Well, actually, I should mention another guy first. He was mayor twice. I was going to talk about him later, but I think he's next up in the queue. A guy named, and I mentioned a lot of our mayors are from other countries, and our only English-born mayor was a guy who was from the Lake District in England. His name was Joseph Jaques. A lot of people see his name and say Jacques, but it doesn't have a C, and Jaques is an English name. I think there's even a character in Shakespeare named Jaques. But this was a guy from the Lake District in England who moved to America as a teenager to work in the salt mines. Things must have been bad for him in England to want to take the long trip across the ocean and only to work in the salt mines of Virginia. but he ended up down here. He was an adventurous guy as a young man. He was a riverboatman, like a lot of people. We have 3 or 4 mayors at least who were former riverboatmen who became mayor. But Jaques was one of them, and was a kind of a mover and shaker, a guy that got a lot done. Was involved in steamboating and railroads, but was mayor briefly in 1858 during this time when there were so many mayors, and then again in 1878 when things were 20 years later. That was a really long time between his 2 terms, but when things were coming together much better for the city of Knoxville. So he was a well-known fellow, better known probably as a businessman than as a mayor, but his if you ever go to Old Gray Cemetery, in the northern part of Old Gray Cemetery, has a rather large obelisk in the on top of kind of a knoll on the over near the National Cemetery. But an interesting guy. He was having to be mayor at the time that another English family, Francis Hawes Burnett, came here, and in the late 1850s, and I wonder if they noted that. Gosh, the mayor of this town is from England too. All right, let's go to the next one. I was talking about a guy that kind of ended this period of instability in Knoxville, and this was James Charles Luttrell, who was mayor briefly before this period, but then for a long time afterwards. And if you note that longer term, that includes the whole Civil War. He was mayor of Knoxville throughout the Civil War. He was a Unionist during the war, and so it's remarkable that when during Confederate occupation they let a Unionist remain mayor of the city, but that didn't mean that he didn't have problems with the Union Army. His biggest complaint that we know about was that the Union Army, after they occupied the city in 1863, that they were storing massive quantities of munitions on Market Square, and he thought, gosh, if this blew up, this would be it for the city that elected me mayor. So he complained to General Burnside about that. I don't know if he had much effect, but he was mayor for quite a long time, and he's notable for something else too, and that he had to he was he 2 of his well, I should mention his mayoral administration. He began something that sounds kind of scary, called the secret police. That was literally what it was called, the secret police in Knoxville. And these were people during a period of instability after the war. And this was a period when there were lynch mobs and lots of things going on in Knoxville and there were burnings, houses were burned down, a school for black children was burned down. But he decided to have that a regular police force couldn't handle this. You needed to have plainclothes people that you didn't know were police, kind of keeping an eye on things, kind of the same way we use people with cell phones today. But he thought the secret police would be people who were secretly commissioned by the city to wander around and look for trouble and see who was causing the trouble. This was his idea. But also the idea was to build a city hall for the first time ever. He thought we should build it. We were big enough to have a city hall, and they decided to build it on the northern end of Market Square. The Market House was on the southern end. City Hall was on the northern end of Market Square. But here's a picture of the city from that era, roughly right just before the Civil War. But you see the Market House is kind of back in the center, and the City Hall was right behind that. But Luttrell was a few other things in his life. He was a state comptroller at one time. I think the only time he lived outside of Knoxville was when the 3 years or so he was state comptroller in Nashville. But he's notable that he had 2 sons. He's the only person who had 2 sons who also were elected mayor of Knoxville after him. And I wonder how many people who saw the name of James C. Luttrell and thought they were voting for his father years earlier. But Sam Bell Luttrell was the other one. But a family of 3 guys, same household, who were mayor of the city over a period, off and on over a period of 20 years or so. Next, moving along, want to get, Marcus DeLafayette Bearden. We have a good deal about him in our new book about Bearden, which is named for him. I mentioned 2 Marcus DeLafayette Beardens, and they were not from the same household even. They were not father and son. They were cousins. I think they knew each other. But this is Marcus DeLafayette Bearden the younger. He's was a Union soldier, was badly wounded in the foot during the war, a wound that perhaps never healed very well. I think he always had a limp, may have had a hard time getting around, but that's remarkable considering he was elected mayor at the same time that he was sheriff of Knox County. He's the only person I know of, certainly, I'm sure he's the only person who ever held both of those jobs, and he held them concurrently. I think people would scream foul about that today. I'm pretty sure they would, but people liked Marcus DeLafayette Bearden very well, and he was a popular guy. Had lived on the west side of town. His family had some farmland over there, but he was later on elected to another position as a state legislator, and was involved in the effort to bring a mental institution to Knoxville. And this was a very big deal. It was a kind of a major progressive coup for the city of Knoxville to have one of the big state mental institutions here. The second one in Tennessee, in fact, was Eastern State Mental Institution, or Asylum, as they called it in those days. And they put it in a beautiful place, a campus-like setting, and right by the river, out off Lions View Drive there. I think they thought it should be in a beautiful place, and it was. Today, of course, it's Lakeshore Park. But the day that this is the original old mental institution, hospital for the insane, as they called it, as it looked, and I'm glad that a good part of this building is still standing. But this building opened in 1886, I believe, and it was just months after the rather sudden death of Marcus DeLafayette Bearden. Interestingly, we don't. There's a peculiar mention. He died in his 50s, rather young, even for that time, for an affluent person to die in their 50s. But it was. But he died, according to the newspaper, of wounds suffered in the late war. And this is 1885, 20 years after the end of the Civil War. And it was not, I don't know for sure, but this bad wound he had in his foot, it was not unknown for old war wounds to get reinfected and to kind of bring the demise of someone who thought that they had gotten over the worst of their wound, would die sometimes as many as 20 years after the war. But anyway, people were still mourning his death when they dedicated the hospital here, and it was about that time that the whole community by the hospital, the Bearden community, which had been known as by several other names, first Aaron, then Cooper, then Crippen, had various different names. It became known as Bearden, and that name stuck and has been ever since for the last 130 years. But all right. We're coming toward the end here. William Rule. This is one of my favorite figures in all of Knoxville history. There aren't many people that you can't find anything bad to say about, but he's one of those people. He was a Union captain in the Civil War. They called him Captain Rule the rest of his life. He had a long life, as you see. Lived to the age of 89. Was a journalist for over 60 of those years. Amazingly, was an editor most of that time, editor of the old Chronicle, then later the Knoxville Journal, and he was still editor of the Journal the day that he died of appendicitis in 1928 at age 89. Amazingly long career, but he was mayor twice, had two separated terms in 1873 and in very late 1890s. And after his second term, he wrote a history of Knoxville, and Rule's history is one of the great sources of history for that era. He goes into much more detail about things of his time and of things before that we wouldn't otherwise know much about if he had not taken the trouble to write them down in a book. But well known for lots of things. He was a very prominent Union veteran. Was one of the here's the arcade building, which is still there today. This is on Gay Street. This is where this building was at, in spite of the 1885 headline there. this was built in 1925. That must be that's a historical headline that we just added there. But this building was built in 1925. The last 4 years of William Rule's life, he worked in this building, and a beautiful marble building. But he was very prominent in the Union veteran, the Grand Army of the Republic, and all their projects, including the big monument in the National Cemetery, the giant monument. That's an effort that he led. The building of that monument. We talked about that recently. It's got a complicated history, as you may know, that the original one was destroyed by lightning, and this was built in 1906. But William Rule was there to see both of them dedicated. Really a stellar guy, a guy that really just did a lot of good for the city that he loved, and never quit even into his 80s. But all right. Next, we have another foreign-born mayor, and that's Mr. Peter Staub, one of the more exotic mayors in our history. He was from Switzerland. He grew up speaking both German and French. He was a tailor, trained as a tailor as a kid, but wound up in Knoxville somehow. And he, during the 1860s, he founded an interesting kind of foreshadowing of what happened to Thomas Hughes and Rugby a few years later. He founded this utopian community called Grootly for Swiss immigrants. It was in the Cumberland Mountains. It was kind of remote, and it was beautiful, but winters were tough, and all these Swiss came there, and they didn't realize how tough it was going to be, and many of them got angry at him. And he decided to kind of remake himself as a city guy, and moved back to Knoxville, and first I think built the Knoxville Opera House, the Staub's Opera House on Gay Street, and which was a big success in 1872. And I suspect it was largely gratitude for that wonderful thing, that great big opera house, which is on the corner right across the street from the Bijou Theater, where that is now, is before the Bijou Theater. But that Staub was elected mayor, and this is really remarkable because at the time that he was mayor, I mentioned how unusual it is to be a mayor and a sheriff at the same time. He was mayor at the same time that he was a consul for the Swiss government in America. He was mayor of Knoxville at the same time, and later became a U.S. consul in Switzerland, but did a lot of traveling back and forth between his native land and Knoxville, spending more time here ultimately. But he was U.S. commissioner to the Paris Exposition of 1878. Anyway, this is the great Staub's Opera House as it was in its heyday. They had operas there. They probably had more vaudeville and lectures. Frederick Douglass spoke there in 1880. They had lots and lots of fascinating. W.C. Fields was there. A lot of the great actors and actresses of the day. Sarah Bernhardt. Lots of you make a long list of people you'd recognize who performed at Staub's Opera House. It was torn down in the 1950s after it had been renamed the Lyric and much simplified, I think, in style. But anyway, this was his family business for a long time. He built this in 1872. His son Fritz ran it for some years after Peter Staub retired. But anyway, Peter Staub had, I think, the most public and dramatic death of any Knoxville mayor. He was I think 77 years old and was killed by an accident involving a runaway horse in downtown Knoxville. After surviving so many trips back and forth on sailing ships to Switzerland and back, it was just a runaway horse on Locust Street that finally killed him. But interesting fellow. All right, and here's a guy I threw in because years ago, back in the 90s, when I was working for Metropulse, I looked in the city portrait gallery, such as it was. They just had some portraits here and there around the city county building, I saw there was this one guy that said Martin Condon 1858 to question mark, or maybe it was just empty. It was just, they didn't have a death date for the guy, and I assumed that he had probably died by then. So I kind of set out to try to figure out what happened to this guy. I'd never heard of him, but learned a few things along the way. I learned that he he had been our first Catholic mayor, and it's remarkable to think that in 1888, just a couple of years after Boston elected his first Catholic mayor, believe it or not, Irish Boston had just elected his Catholic mayor in around 1879 or 80. Knoxville, Tennessee had a Catholic mayor as well. I could not tell, I looked at all the papers, I could not tell that anybody raised an issue about it. It just was not a big deal. But Martin Condon was very active as a young man. He was in the late 1880s. This was really, Knoxville was really cresting in a big way. Was really becoming a real city. It had a library. It had lots of things going for it. But it was in 1888 that the Catholic Church, which had been built up on the hill here, had a steeple, and the city decided to save some money by asking if they could install a clock in the steeple of the Catholic Church. And I don't know for sure that Condon had anything to do with this idea, but the Catholic Church provided the altitude for this clock, and the city installed and owned the clock and took care of it for many years. And the clock is still there. In fact, I turn around right now, I can see it out my window. But this was a clock that you could see from Market Square and from the train station. Really, two places very far away. But this was just a little connection besides Martin Condon between the city and the Catholic Church at that same era. But anyway, Martin Condon, though, he was a young man when he was mayor. He was just in his only 30 years older, I think, at the time he was mayor. But he left town as a young man, and right after he was mayor, I mentioned that some people don't stay in town after they're mayor, and he didn't. And it took a while for me to find out what became of him. I got some clues from my old friend Martin Hunt, who actually said he was named for Martin Condon. He died a few years ago. But I found out that he had made some money in the snuff business, in the chewing tobacco business, and had a company called Bruton Condon Snuff Company. But I didn't know the extent to which he took that. It was a big success with a Nashville-based company, but it was a big success, and he became such a big leader in the field of chewing tobacco that he became the president of the American Tobacco Company, based in New York. And he had a mansion in Westchester, in New York. Became a well-known golfer. Was a multi-millionaire, and I think our most successful mayor after he was mayor of any. But oddly, he was completely forgotten at home. As I mentioned, there was the beautiful portrait of him in the city county building, with a birth date but no death date. Well, he ended up in Memphis, which is where he died in 1940. So we have put together the rest of his life. They say that he would often come back to East Tennessee and stay at Tate Springs, and wouldn't necessarily make a big deal of himself in the city that he had been mayor of many years earlier. And it's interesting to think that you could, go to a city that you were mayor of 50 years ago. Can you imagine that? But that was Martin Condon. But okay, next one is Peter Curran. We just have one more after this. This is taking a bit longer than I intended to. But Peter Curran was our last foreign-born mayor, at least up to now. He was from Germany originally. Had a fascinating story about how he arrived in Knoxville. He was a shoemaker. He arrived here as a refugee of the revolutions of 1848. His mother was really worried about his futures in Germany, and it must take a unusual mother's love to actually get your kid put him on a boat and know that you're never going to see him again, just for his own safety. But that's what happened to Peter Kern. He came here to America by himself and moved around. Some lived in New York for a while, lived down south for a while, at Charleston or somewhere, I think, and just kept kind of moving around north and south, couldn't decide where to live, ended up in Georgia. And when the Civil War broke out, all of his neighbors were joining the Georgia infantry, and he did too, the Confederate Army. And he went off to war, was wounded fairly early in the war, was sent off back to home to recuperate, with the promise that he would return to the front when he was better. And he was very dutifully on the train back to the front, the Virginia front, when the train stopped in Knoxville the day that the Union Army took over Knoxville. So he was captured, held in jail just as an enemy, I guess, of the Union Army. But they decided he was not a problem. They interviewed him, and they said this guy's harmless. And they told him, well, we'll let you go, but there's one rule: you can't leave this city called Knoxville. He never heard of it before, I don't think, or at least never had gotten off the train here. And you can't leave here for the balance of the war. And he didn't know how long that would be, but he met another German immigrant here, and who had this idea of selling hoe cakes, molasses hoe cakes, to troop trains. And they both went in on this together and did so well. And Peter Kern, who was a cobbler, decided that he liked baking better, and he loved to bake bread, and he baked cakes, and he made candy. He made all these things and did really well at this after the Civil War, and eventually built the Peter Kern Bakery, the Peter Kern building, which is still standing on Market Square, at 1 Market Square. But interestingly, that building, notably at the southwest corner of Market Square, has that address of 1 Market Square. It was in 1890 that the city changed its approach to addresses. Before 1890, all addresses had been 1 or 2 or 3 numerals, basically based on their distance from the river or from the closest the southern intersection. And Market Square was numbered differently from the whole rest of the city. It was, and by this new standard, this should be in the 400 range. But I think Peter Kern liked the number 1 Market Square, so he made an exception for Market Square, and that allowed him to keep that address. But this is Kern's Bakery. I'm really glad that building is still there. It was not just Kern's Bakery; it was Kern's he had the ice cream saloon was on the 2nd floor. The Oddfellows Hall was on the 3rd floor, where they sometimes had public events, public concerts and things. The ground floor was where the soda fountain and the toy store and all the candy shop and all those things were. It was really just an emporium of delights, and this is something that Peter Kern was very proud of. He celebrated all the holidays. He was one of the first people. It's funny that he was however briefly, a Confederate soldier, because he was one of the first people to celebrate Lincoln's birthday in Knoxville, and made a big deal of that. But he really loved Christmas. Being from Germany, he loved the holiday of Christmas, and arguably, this is one of the earliest Christmas ads we see with Santa Claus, and this is a Kern's Bakery ad. But he loved Christmas and celebrated in a big way. He was a big jolly guy, and kind of showed people how to celebrate Christmas in Tennessee, where we had not made a big deal out of Christmas before. The Germans and Irish especially arrived here in the mid-19th century. But anyway, a great story, Peter Kern, just all around. But as I say, he was our last. This guy who was here accidentally in 1863 became so popular. He was elected mayor, and was our last mayor with a foreign accent in 1890. All right, we'll talk about one more mayor, and then we'll call it a night. But this is Sam Heiskell, and he is, remember the name Heiskell, Frederick Heiskell. This is the great nephew of Frederick Heiskell. He was actually born in Monroe County, but of course was familiar with Knoxville through his uncle. but he was the only mayor to serve 4 non-consecutive terms, off and on for 20 years. He was in fact, he served in office longer than any mayor in Knoxville history before Victor Ashe, who I kind of broke a new record that will not be broken again with term limits. But over a period of 20 years, he was mayor for 4 non-consecutive terms. He was also an attorney and historian, maybe our most intellectual mayor, because he was an author and national authority on the Jacksonian era. His books are still, I know a Jacksonian scholar. He said, oh, Sam Heiskell, really? Yeah, I know his work well, from the early 20th century. This is one of the early respected multi-volume books about Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian era, especially in Tennessee. But he was a progressive in most respects. He helped to start schools for Black children. He also started a mental hospital on the campus of the Eastern State Asylum for Black citizens. And also, he was the guy that was behind building the Market House that many people older than me remember very well in 1897. This was, if you can blame this on any mayor, it was Sam Heiskell, and a lot of stuff was going on. Sam Heiskell was the first mayor known to have ridden in an automobile and actually got out of the automobile to dedicate the Ornstein building when it was just right across the street from here. But was behind lots of things that happened. He was mayor during the Appalachian Expositions, the National Conservation Exposition. Some of the biggest events in Knoxville history to this day had either Sam Heiskell presiding over them or were his idea altogether. But a guy that deserves to be remembered very well. There was one more guy that I think I'll save for next time. By the way, here's the Marble Bandstand, which is the only building that dates back to the days of the expositions in 1910, 1911, and 1913. But we'll save one mayor for the next time. I think in a few more weeks, we're going to have a part 2 of this mayor's thing. We decided not to do both of them back to back, but maybe in about a month we'll do the 20th century mayors, and we're going to talk about a guy named William Gass, who is the last mayor to have more or less vanished from the face of the earth, and also the only mayor to have gone to prison. So we'll talk more about him next time, rather than ending on that note. But Knoxville. All right, if there's anybody still hanging on out there, I would be happy to take questions. I'm as patient as you all are. So if anybody has any questions about our mayors in the 19th century, let me know. I only kind of brush the surface of them. They're about I went through about 20 of them. I think there are about 20 more to talk about sometime. We'll be talking about 20th century mayors next time, but next time meaning probably a month from now. Yeah.
We should recognize that we have 2 former mayors with us, Victor Ashe and Daniel Brown.
Oh, no kidding, Dan.
Thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate it. Both of you you're good. Appreciate your being here. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight.